Thank you for joining us today. My name's Martin Bush and I'm the convener of the History and Philosophy of Science seminar series. Today's seminar is a special event held as part of the 2021 University of Melbourne Science Festival. This year's Science Festival is on the value and costs of science. As usual, we've gathered a panel together to discuss this theme from the perspectives of HPS, that is, history, philosophy and sociology of science. Joining us today are Professor Joan Leach, Director of the Centre for Public Awareness of Science at ANU, Dr. Jason Chin from the University of Sydney Law School, and Dr. Darren Durant from HPS at the University of Melbourne. I'll start with an acknowledgement of country and recognise that I am seated on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and that wherever you are in Australia, you exist on Indigenous Australian land, the sovereignty of which was never ceded. As well as Wurundjeri lands, our panellists also join us today from Ngunnawal and Gadigal lands. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend a special welcome to all Indigenous Australian colleagues who are joining us today. I acknowledge the unique and age-old role that Indigenous Australians have played on country, and I reflect on the continuing role that Indigenous cultures have with land and knowing in this place. I encourage all non-Indigenous colleagues to consider ways of paying the rent, and I choose to pay the rent for this seminar through paytherent.net.au. To today's panel discussion. Science is many things and it can have many values. One straightforward implication of this theme is thinking about economic values and the rewards that science can bring in that regard. This is a way of thinking that has been present since the very foundation of this university, at least, at which the opening of which the Governor Latrobe indicated that the one thing that this colony needed for progress and further economic development was science. But of course, observations like this prompt us to ask not just what is the value of science, but what are the values embedded in how science is practiced and for whom it benefits. Of course, science promises more social benefits as well, contributions to public policy, legal and medical problems in society. This aspect, of course, has been very much highlighted in recent years, but at the same time, it has been highly contested. Science scholars have long appreciated that building scientific knowledge is a complex affair, and understanding how that knowledge gets made is no easier than it ever was. Today, the facts of science are scrutinised by both supporters and opponents. But if science is more than mere facts, how do we involve the processes of science in decision-making? A pretense of infallibility seems counterproductive in public debate, so how do we balance the acknowledgement of error with the recognition of expertise? Why do some scientific issues become so messy? These are just some of the questions we can ask on this topic, and our guests today have expertise across this range. I will first introduce our three guests in turn before handing over to each of them for a short presentation on an area of their expertise. After that, we will open up to questions and comments from the floor. A few ground rules before we go. Please do keep your microphones muted until we get to question time. If you have any questions or comments that come up along the way, please drop them into the chat window. When we do reach the open discussion, because we're a fairly large group today, I will ask you to use the raise hand facility in the participants tab. And this session is being recorded. And so if you do not wish to appear on the recording, please keep your camera off and use the chat panel for any questions or comments you have. And I will now drop those notes into chat as well. Thanks. So to our panelists, and we'll start off with Professor Joan Leach. Joan, you're the Director of the Centre for the Public Awareness of Science at ANU. Can you tell us a little bit about this centre and its work?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much, Martin. So CPASS is a kind of old centre as these things go, although certainly not as old as HPS, for example, at Melbourne, but it sort of came into being in the late 1980s. The work of this centre is really interesting in the sense that since its inception, it's had the same tagline. You know how centres have to have these kind of little taglines describing themselves, and since that point, we've always had the tagline that we're in existence to help make science accessible. And we actually use an additional word there. We'd like to make science democratically accessible. And so that's been our tagline for, over 30 years. And we do that in a number of ways. I mean, the way that we're best known, although it's just a small portion of our work, is through informal learning advocacy. So Questacon, the National Science Center, kind of grew up with CPASS. And so we do a lot of work in informal science learning. But we're also interested in forums where people can have the difficult conversations around science. And that can be around GM, around quantum, around nano, around any of the controversial topics. Lots about climate as well. So those forums. We're interested in enabling and empowering researchers, scientists, experts to be able to handle having difficult conversations about their work. And to be open, democratically open to having those difficult discussions. And we do a lot of research that kind of crosses over all of the questions that go into that. I guess finally, the thing I'd say, and we're extraordinarily proud of this, I think, is that we've also kind of created a generation of a new kind of role. And these are, people who do knowledge brokering, science communication, and they're mediating the important knowledge about science. So that's what the center does.
Great, thanks. And in terms of your own work, touches on some of those things, and there's many strands, but a couple that I'd highlight is the focus on the international aspects of science communication and the ethical dimensions of science communication, in contrast, sort of with perhaps some older views that had a rather technical skills view of science communication. Can you tell us a bit about your own work in these regards?
Yeah, so in the international front, I think it's really interesting to look back since, approximately World War II, to look at sort of national trends in sort of managing the science-society relationship. That can be in policy, that can be in, cultural institutions like science centers. And so just finished a really big project with input from about 40 countries, territories worldwide, kind of telling that story from World War II about the way in which different nations imagined the science-society relationship. Was science in service to particular national goals and priorities, or is science part of government? That's another way of thinking about it. So just kind of canvassing that kind of rich array of ways of conceiving that relationship. And so we produced a volume free from ANU Press. You can download it all for free. I'm not selling anything. It's called Science Communication of a Global Perspective. So that was a really eye-opening project with a bit of history of science thrown in. And then, some of my more recent work is about the ethics of science communication. As we've created a generation of people who do this knowledge brokering, what kinds of burdens do they have? What obligations, responsibilities do they have? And I'll touch a little bit maybe on some of these questions in my 7 minute, but it isn't just that science communication is there to advocate for science. Our position is very much that it's advocating for a kind of accessibility, a kind of a two-way dialogue and exchange. And with that comes obligations. Yeah, so that's kind of where my work's been recently.
Great, thanks so much. I'll now introduce Dr. Jason Chin from the law school at the University of Sydney. And so, Jason, you're based at a law school, which might not be the first place that people think to look for scholarship on science studies. Can you tell us how you became interested in issues of scientific evaluation within the law?
Yeah, thanks, Martin. So my original degree was in psychology. I started up studying social and cognitive psychology. The original plan for my dissertation was to replicate and extend one of my advisors' key findings, but I couldn't do the first step. I kept trying to replicate it, trying different iterations, getting new stimuli, trying to figure out what I was doing wrong. I couldn't do it, so I wasn't really publishing anything. Eventually, became a bit sort of disillusioned with it. I was more at the time, I blamed myself primarily. I thought there was something wrong with my abilities as a researcher. So when I finished grad school, started doing some kind of just basically trade work. Needed a profession, I wanted a career, so I beyond that, so I went to law school. And as I started working as a lawyer, well, two things happened. One, I learned that other people couldn't replicate that study, so it wasn't just me. It became obvious that lots of findings in psychological science weren't replicable. And two, I was working cases where there was all this disputed scientific evidence, and law, as I'll talk about in my little spiel, has its own norms and rules about how to evaluate science. So I got really interested in how scientists look at science and how the law looks at science and what it needs. And that's kind of the main thing I research now.
Great. And, in terms of replicability in open science, I should mention that both you and I are on the current board of AMOS, the Association for Interdisciplinary Meta-Research and Open Science, which is having a conference in November this year. Do you want to give a quick plug for AMOS? Yep,
I just put the link in the chat. And I think it's a wonderful organization. I think one of the only sort of organizing bodies within this field of just generally open science and research on research. Generally, I know there are specific sort of sub areas, and it's truly interdisciplinary. We have members and attendees from all kinds of fields, and the conference is coming up in the end of November. Got some really cool speakers, Rose O'Day, Sarah DeReek, Julia Rohrer and Brian Nosek are all giving invited talks, and then loads of smaller talks and sessions. Please come along.
Good. Thanks. And I'll now introduce our third speaker for today, Darren Durant, from History and Philosophy of Science here at the University of Melbourne. Darren, you're an STS scholar, that is Science, Technology and Society Scholarship. For those who are unfamiliar with this field, can you give a quick introduction to it and what it is and how it helps us think about these kinds of questions that we're posing today?
It's pretty hard. I should give it, you want me to give a definition of STS? Maybe Jeremy could do that one better than, I would say STS really just asks really annoying questions about how we know things as a collective, right? So that really shoves it all there in one particular way. Why is it that we disagree about things? Why is disagreement to be expected? How do we move past disagreement? How do we do that as collectives rather than individuals? So in my understanding, science and technology studies is a collective sociological effort. So that's my version of it. Yeah.
That's great. That's very concise. In terms of your particular work, you've got a lot of your recent work has been on disinformation and democracy, including a current Canadian government grant on this project. Can you tell us a little bit about this project?
Yeah, we have an international team here in Australia, Canada, and the UK, and we have a SHIRK grant. SHIRK is the Canadian equivalent of Australia's ARC. Just nicer people, it's Canadians, right? But no, so we have a disinformation grant, and one of the things that we're looking at is we started tracking last year. They extended the grant. We started tracking last year just various disinformation trails. Obviously, we started tracking COVID. Later on, we built that into things like ivermectin research, vaccine hesitancy, these kinds of things. So we started tracking those, and Twitter made it easy for us at one stage because they rejigged how we could search their databases. So we redid that, but also a bunch of Reddit forums, Facebook forums, subreddit forums. So just tracking a lot of information. And one of the things that we're looking at specifically, because lots of people do disinformation research and pursue how disinformation impacts democratic discussion and so forth. One of the things that we're looking at is some of the specific mechanisms that you can unearth for how disinformation can shift norms of discussion. So we're interested in the kind of moral, evaluative component of the way that disinformation acts on those norms of discussion and trying to unearth some of those kinds of dynamics. As I said, anyone who does disinformation research realizes that people come at it from all kinds of angles, the algorithmic, the computer, cognitive psychology. So we're trying to bring a kind of mixture of sociological STS and political theory and computational analysis. So we have a computer genius in our team who does the algorithms, obviously. So that's kind of what we do.
Great. Thanks so much. So that's our three panelists today. I'm now going to hand the floor over to each of them to give us a short presentation. And we'll start off with Professor Joan Leach, who I believe has no slides to share, but I'll start with this introductory slide and hand over to you, Joan.
Thank you very much, Martin, and thank you so much for putting this panel together. I'm absolutely delighted. And I'm also feeling very happy to see all these people because we're amateurs in the ACT at being in lockdown, and I know my Melbourne colleagues and Sydney colleagues are a bit more professional at this, and so hints and tips are welcome, but it's just very nice to have a conversation this week with colleagues. Yeah, so I am on Ngunnawal land, and I want to acknowledge their elders past and present, and pay my respects to them. And I need to thank you again, Martin, because you've put together a topic for us that is two kind of huge categories, expertise and values. And my head sort of exploded a little bit. And so I'm going to tackle the values piece because I saw that Darren and Jason were going to talk a little bit more about expertise. We'll see. And then maybe we can put it all together in the discussion. So what I want to do is unpack sort of three ways of thinking about the relationship between value and science. And kind of I'll narrate this as a kind of my own journey through some of these questions. So when I was a PhD student, I was moving from biophysics research into history and philosophy of science at the University of Pittsburgh. I tell you this so that you know why I see what I saw then. Talking about the value of science was a bit of an outre thing to do. It was something that scientists did in a moment of advocacy. And sort of, this would be for researchers or experts kind of defending science by talking about its value. And in the version of history and philosophy of science that I grew up in, that wasn't really what we were interested in. Instead, what we were interested in is how values were baked into science. And that's a really rich kind of vein of scholarship, and it's kind of contributed a lot to the way in which I see science communication working. So my way of thinking about science communication and public engagement with science is very much informed by this tradition of talking about values in science rather than talking about the value of science. So thinking back to some of the questions that got me started in this field, like the question, do the values that researchers hold enrich or subvert or infect or change the scientific enterprise? And I think that's still a pretty fundamental question. And I think there aren't too many weeks that go by that I don't get asked questions, for example, around climate science, that is it that someone, a researcher that has green politics, does that make their science their science and biodiversity sort of questionable? Can they still be objective or something when they're doing this kind of research? And so this debate, continues. And so there's a big question about how we deal with such values. Now, one of the approaches when I kind of come to apply a lot of the work when I work with researchers is to kind of come clean. That it's quite useful to talk about the way in which they see their own values motivating their work, perhaps impacting the way in which they come at certain problems and projects, and the way that they motivate others to read and interpret that work. So that vein of scholarship, I think, has been really kind of important to the way I think about science communication. There's also the case that we know from a huge range of historical and philosophical studies that values inform entire fields and have kind of guided the context of discovery in science. So I work at, I'm just thinking of, work at the University of Melbourne, thinking about women's brains and physiology still being relative terra incognita in relation to men's brains and physiology. And that has been informed by a certain concept of value in science. And, when we think about definitions of race, how we deal with diversity in relation to science, these are very, very live issues. And again, the way in which those definitions get played out has a lot to do with how we sort of bake those values into science as it's practiced. And of course, I don't think it's just that values are political values. Values are baked into our ideas about objectivity. So there's also a rich strand of scholarship thinking about somebody like Heather Douglas, who talks about, if you think that objectivity is the view from nowhere, you're valuing a certain kind of perspective. And if you're thinking about it as the view from everywhere, it's a different kind of value or perspective. So all of these things have been incredibly impactful for me thinking about values in science and how we need to surface them, talk about them, and communicate about them. And of course, in the field, our journal titles, Science, Technology, and Human Values, Agriculture and Human Values, have kind of hit on that notion that what we really care about is values in science. So I'm confessing that I grew up thinking that talking about the value of science in the kind of economic way that Martin introduced it was just not something very scholarly or respectable if you weren't an economist. However, this is part of my voyage of discovery. A book in 2011 really changed the way I started to think about this issue. And it was the book called Science Smart. I don't know if you know it, it got mixed reviews, Philip Murawski. And he made this really, really interesting set of arguments, I think, that it's a kind of a story about the way in which a neoliberal ideology kind of overtook the way in which science started to think of itself. And it's basically a story about the move from big government-funded institutions, which purported certain values, to a kind of rhetoric of privatization and a commodification of science. And this was a really, really interesting, big, grand story that made me sit back and think, well, actually, there's some more work to do here. And the relationships between thinking about values in science and the value of science maybe haven't been surfaced as much as they could be. So I've been thinking a lot about this, and one of the projects I just talked about a little while ago, looking at national trends in the way in which nation states talk about their value of science, has kind of come from that, that work that I think Philip's book did in 2011. But then there's another strand of work that kind of looks at this in a more intimate way. And I'm really pleased working with a colleague, Rachel Ankeny, to look at the way in which people articulate their values, for example, around genetic modification, gene editing, and those kinds of issues. And we just did a big kind of review of the literature with my colleague, Will Grant, and also Heather Bray. And what struck me as we looked across this literature was a kind of way of articulating value as willingness to pay. Okay, that's what dominates the way in which people research how publics value certain things. So, what's the price premium you're willing to pay for an organic apple? What's the price discount you might expect on something labeled, if it was labeled GM or CRISPR? Would you pay more for something that was merely gene edited? Or would you pay less for a tomato which also has a gene from a fish in it, right? These kinds of questions, they dominate the literature. And these sorts of questions of value became really, really fascinating to me. And they started to beg these questions of both values in science. Why are we asking people, for example, to accept technologies that have already been developed? Seems a kind of funny way around the value question. And the value of science. Is this really about feeding the world, or is this about something else, as Phil Murawski kind of asked me to think about? So 3 ways of talking about value. And of course, philosophers will say there's plenty more. But when you have these ways of talking about value, equivocation always becomes an issue when we slide in from talking about values in science to talking about values of science. And this can be kind of suspect. I think we need to do a little bit of work at cleaning up our way about talking about these things. But I think there are three ways here. The values in science, I feel academically comfortable with. The value of science, which kind of scientists use to gain financial support. And then there's this third way, with apologies, I think, to Tony Blair, which is about values in and of science and technology. And this third way, I think, is becoming incredibly intellectually attractive, to me at least, to pursue. I'm still not interested in advocating in a blanket way for something generic called science. I'll leave that to experts. But we could really do some work on understanding the values baked into science and how these do or don't correspond to larger public values. Okay, this could explain lots of little questions about why we might pay more for an organic apple. But I also think it's really exciting because we can start articulating or reworking on a project about science as a public good, which is a public value question. And so that's kind of where my work is headed, with a number of colleagues looking at the value of science and articulating it as a public good instead of one that is only private. And I'll leave it there, Martin.
Thanks very much, Joan. We will leave all of the questions and comments until we've heard from all of our speakers. So we will move straight on to Jason. Jason does have some slides which I'll be running, so I'll try to get through them, but you'll have to prompt me if I need to flick the slides, Jason.
Sure. Thanks. And I think I only do the first 8. I think you were right earlier that it's too much. Yes, as I mentioned earlier, I'm quite interested in this idea of what does the legal system, what do courts, what do judges, what does the law think knowledge and expertise is? And how does that compare, as Joan was talking about, to what scientists think knowledge and expertise is? Because I think every field has its own norms. And I certainly learn a lot every time I talk to folks like Martin and Fiona about, because I'm still quite a neophyte when it comes to HPS and STS and these fields that have been struggling with this question for a long time. So just to give a little background on the kind of the problem, it's so here this is the legal, this at least in New South Wales and in most jurisdictions in Australia, this is the legal definition of expertise. It's if a person has specialized knowledge based on their training, study, or experience, then they're an expert. It's framed as an exception because there's a presumption that witnesses will only give facts. Again, what does a fact mean? But for law, a fact is something they saw or observed themselves, but we make allowances for expert witnesses to give their opinion. So inferences based on facts. And this is an interesting question. You can go to the next slide, because lots of injustices have happened because expert witnesses have been wrong, have been giving evidence that was based on invalid science, if we can make that distinction. It turns out that the practice they were using has a really high error rate that they hadn't told the court about, or had never actually been tested. It's like no one knows the error rate, it had never been tested before. So can we use the definitions of specialized knowledge to try to prevent that from happening? I'll go to the next slide. So one of the key areas in which this has happened is in the area of forensic science. There was this landmark report in 2009 from the National Academy of Sciences where they reviewed several different practices and found that most had never been tested. And they say, the bottom line is that many forensic science professionals haven't established the validity of their approach. And here's the part I'm interested in. And the courts have been utterly ineffective in addressing this problem. So what they seem to be saying is that because this is a field that's designed for us lawyers and judges and other stakeholders in the criminal justice system, we should be imposing our legal value or some sort of value system, some sort of safeguard on this field that is not regulating itself. And how could that happen? Let's look at how the rule has been interpreted by that Section 79 I just mentioned has been interpreted by New South Wales courts. Can go to the next one. for some reason, and you can, if you just put all of the, click through to all the reviews, sorry. So for some reason, most of the cases in this area have been in this, well, I think probably the reason is because recently people who have become savvy when they're doing a crime and they hide their face because there's all this CCTV footage, and the police and the prosecution still wants to find some way to identify people even though their faces are obscured. So most of the leading cases in this area are in what is sometimes called body mapping. And it's an expert who claims to be able to identify somebody based on their posture and the way they're holding themselves and the slope of their shoulders and the size of their head, rather than their facial features. And that's what happened in this case, Tang. Click to the next one. And just go to the end of it. What happened here was the expert, Dr. Cicino, was pretty clearly had some qualifications in doing face map and facial identification. So the prosecution witness asked her, now you've conducted all these comparisons and all these things as part of your method to form a view as to identify the person in the black shirt as Mr. Tang. Is that correct? And she says yes. The results lend themselves to a positive identification. Given my experience looking at faces and analyzing them, matching them, etc., I form the opinion that the number of matches of the body of the body shape of this person means they're one and the same, which I think we would all probably agree here is an improper extension of her expertise. If you go to the next one, and the court, I think in that respect, came to the right decision. It said, look, it's undoubted that she has expertise in facial identification, but not in body mapping. So we're going to exclude her evidence for that reason. Where I think the problem came and what people wanted them to do was to say specialized knowledge must include some aspect of reliability, however you want to define that. Because otherwise it would be very easy just to create a field of body mapping and make a journal for it and give people certain designations within that field. But unfortunately, the court here said the focus of attention must be on the word specialized knowledge and not the introduction of an extraneous idea such as reliability. So legally, in an exercise of statutory construction, the court is saying that knowledge doesn't mean reliability. And we can't read that in without maybe some sort of legislative intervention. And this is, I think, the last slide coming up, Martin. So this led, just 2 years ago, a sitting judge, actually the chief judge of the Victorian courts, Chris Maxwell, to say, look, he wrote this article in a journal. He says, look, I can't do my job anymore. The role of the gatekeeper on questions of reliability is established in other jurisdictions, but the last sentence of the abstract there is there's an urgent need for legislative intervention here. And if you go to the next one, they were thinking about that. The Attorney General was thinking about that, but eventually decided to not pursue amending the laws when it comes to forensic science evidence or scientific evidence generally. So, I mean, we should probably end there. I think I've gone too long, but so a big thrust of my research has been, well, how do we get these fields that regularly interact with the legal system to kind of raise their game if the courts aren't going to impose a higher standard on them, or how do we encourage courts to interpret the law in a way that would be a little more cautious about scientific evidence? Thanks, Martin.
Thank you, Jason, and apologies for a few slide formatting glitches in translating your deck into my Mac.
Thank you.
We'll move on to Darren Durant. And I think you've got one slide for us. Are you just going to speak to that slide for the whole time? Is that, or are you going to tell me when to put it up? You'll just have to unmute yourself there, Darren.
Sorry, the kid was talking to me back in the background. I'm okay. I can either use the slide or not use the slide. It doesn't matter.
Well,
there's the slide apparently. Okay. What will I say about this? So I took it literally, the value of science, shall we say? Right. So I'll work with that, and we'll see where we get to the value of science. I think there's a classic way of understanding the value of science, and we could say that the value of science is that science can inform our public deliberations. It plays this information provision role, for instance, feeding into our public discussions and our decision making. And the other classic role is that once we've all decided on something, so that once we've decided on the ends and the values that we want to pursue and so forth, that science can be the means to achieve those particular ends that we've collectively decided. And of course, the other classic role for the value of science is that science speaks, as we say, science speaks truth to power. And most of us here will all realize that there are problems with each one of those classic understandings of the value of science. So we know, for instance, that there's both alienation problems and communication problems that are going to affect all of those classic roles. And I'm not sure I need to go too far into those issues. We know that the alienation problem, they're the things that Habermas and Weber talked about, for instance, scientism and decisionism, trying to reduce issues down to just whatever the fact is, becomes problematic for many reasons, including the fact-value distinction being problematic itself, or decisionism, that you kind of slough off values discussions as too soft in order to allow us to reach decisions. So therefore you try and ignore that and you just use some facts and you back end into the scientism problem. So we know there's alienation problems with all those classic roles, and we also know that there's communication problems themselves. There's issues with the way that science tends to define reality in relatively partisan ways or exclusionary ways. We all know that there's communication problems because deficit models of communications are very inadequate. They suck, in general speak. And we also know that there's a real radical critique which says that science becomes a problem for democracy because as soon as science gets involved in our democratic discussions, you end up with scientific reasoning basically infecting our deliberative discussions and distorting them all of the time, so that the more science you have feeding in, the worse the outcome happens to be. So what that suggests to me is that the classic ways that we have for defending the value of science are actually inadequate, because they all get undermined in some particular way. And it's probably why it's probably part of the explanation for why we have such a rank problem with trust in science in the modern day. Because the classic understandings of the value of science don't tend to work. They all get undermined in some particular way. So the two bubble diagrams down below shift gears a little bit. And what I want to suggest as a way of thinking of the value of science is to maybe develop some analogies about some problems that we see in democracy that science might be able to give us some guides to. So I want to say something like, imagine that we took science as a model and then we ran that over into maybe how that model of how things might work in science and what science does, how could that be a model for, or a way that we can address some of our problems in contemporary democracy? Now, clearly there's a few caveats we want to give there. The first caveat being that I'm not replicating Philip Kitcher's argument. If you've read Philip Kitcher's arguments about whatever that book was called, Science and Democracy, or I can't remember what that argument from Philip Kitcher, or what that book title was from Philip Kitcher. But there was a distinct problem with Kitcher's argument, which was an overly idealized model of science. Kitcher basically says, well, science has this way of reaching consensus, that ignores its own differences, and it has this standardized, rationalized way. And of course, Kitcher was wrong about how that kind of works. So we have to do, if we're going to extend the model out, we can't do it on the way that Kitcher does it, for instance, right? So I don't mean it in that particular sense. And also, nor do I mean it, the other caveat has to be that if we want to say that we take science as a model, we certainly don't want to say, for instance, that we replicate what really is the scientism problem, where we say that science deals really well with facts. Let's just turn our democratic discussions into just about facts and that will solve things. See, that just replicates the alienation problem. All right, so with those two caveats, in other words, if you come back to me and give me those two arguments against me, I'll say, remember what I just said. right? So with those two particular caveats in place, what are some other ways that we could think of the value in science, or sorry, the value of science? And clearly I'm not saying the value of science just because the science has a value in and of itself, right? I'm going to say that it has a function to play in our broader societies. We don't live in scientific societies. We live in democratic societies, for instance. We don't live in societies that are dedicated towards finding, the next quark. We live in societies that are dedicated towards not dying from coronavirus tomorrow and stuff like that. So we have to think of the value of science for the societies that we live in, and we live in these liberal capitalist democracies, shall we say, right? So what's the value of science in those kinds of things? So two models that I'll suggest as thought bubbles. One is, and there's a kind of an essential tension if you look at those two thought bubbles, like trust in science and science in democracy. There's a little bit of an essential tension there, kind of riffing on Kuhn's idea of the essential tension between things like innovation and creativity. There's a little bit of an essential tension here. The one, when we think about trust in science itself, you tend to have different kinds of solutions to this. So one solution for, and Martin, I'm prepared, I'm okay for taking off the thing. I think people have seen the general scheme, for instance, right? That way I can see who I'm talking to. I put it on gallery view. Okay, so there's clearly a bit of an attention here. If we think trust in science, we kind of got two solutions. Stephen Shapin, the historian of science, talked about this. And one solution is to use all of the tools that we normally use in contemporary times, institutional accounting mechanisms. If we want to make sure that science is trustworthy, we make sure that there's a big guard dog looking over science, some kind of institutional mechanism. And Shapin suggests that's kind of failing us, and it is kind of failing us. One way that it fails us is that it means that we lose track of all of the interpersonal, face-to-face trust relations that make for collective scientific research, right? That kind of stuff drops out of the story a little bit, and we don't think it's important, but of course we all know that it's important because most of us who study pieces of scientific research, we realize that these things are important. That's the grist to mill of most science studies analysis, for instance. So Shapin suggests this idea of virtue, which is obviously a quaint 18th century idea, right? But Shapin says, how could we resuscitate that idea? What would it be to resuscitate that idea of virtue, for instance? It must be something about recovering the sense of how trust relations are formed and sustained as collectives work together in face-to-face exchanges or in small communities, core research projects, etc. Trust is kind of getting sustained in all those kinds of ways. So if science has a value for our democracies, could science be a model for how trust relations are sustained and formed at the interpersonal levels, usually in small communities? And in other words, could it be a model for thinking about how diverse inputs into a community nevertheless are capable of producing either A, forms of agreement, or B, forms of spectrums of agreement, majority and minority reports that are actionable for larger contexts without, of course, going to war with each other, right? So could science be a model for that? In other words, does it say to us that if we want to solve some of our problems in democracy, we have to rethink some of the ways that we're thinking about our trust relations in democracy? And science tells us that you don't get trust relations unless you've got these smaller communities, face-to-face interactions, and building your interconnections up that way. And this is the basis of trust, for instance, because knowledge circulates around these trust relations, right? Or as Shapin described it, there's a moral economy to science. What counts as a result and whether you think it's a good result follows your trust relations along through diverse communities, right? So could that be a model for how we could think about our trust relations in our broader liberal capitalist democracies? That's one question. The second question is taking the other side of it, the science in democracy. And the science in democracy, I'm going to suggest it as a kind of a longue durée analogy here, for instance. We're all aware that the problem is going to be that if we want science to play a role in our democracies, maybe we want science to help us make decisions, for instance, but we realize that our decisions blur the fact-value boundary. We realize that no amount of fact is going to determine what our value judgment happens to be. Now, the question becomes, have we overinterpreted that problem? If you go all the way back to Weber, he of course formulated the fact-value distinction for us. And then he said, guess what happens with that fact-value distinction? You end up in disenchantment, right? Because you've got some facts, but the facts are not going to really tell you much about what to do with those value judgments, and we all get disenchanted, right? And most people would say we have a relatively disenchanted world today, for instance. So if you take that particular analogy, does science have as a model anything that could tell us about that? Well, actually, it does seem to be suggesting some things to us. One thing it suggests to us is the loyal opposition idea. So we know, for instance, that a real problem in democracy, as Trump showed by marching the troops onto the Congress steps, is that loyal opposition, we shouldn't take it for a joke. So in a democracy, we want to make sure that the losers go, bugger, I lost, I'll stick around for the next try, right? So loyal opposition is important if you want a functioning democracy. And one of the things that happens in science, of course, is that science gets it wrong all the time and keeps plugging away. And groups of scientists get into disagreements with each other and keep plugging away. They still sustain a connection with each other. So loyal opposition in the sciences is there all the time, right? Even in and through all of its huge disagreements, you still sustain this thing called science, even through all of that, which science studies talks about all the time. So my question as an analogy is, does that actually tell us something about that loyal opposition idea in democracy? And might it tell us something about the disenchantment problem that Weber talked about? So we know, for instance, that the fact can't tell us it can't unilaterally determine that value judgment. But is it as disconnected as we all think, right? In other words, was Weber kind of wrong? Did he overdraw this? And one place where that discussion took place was in the late 60s, Alvin Gouldner, right? And Gouldner took a real hard run at Weber and said, I think we've overextended Weber. And Gouldner said, let's look at the context that Weber was talking about this fact-value distinction. And Weber was saying that we really want this fact-value distinction and we want this thing called objectivity, because if we don't have it, what you'll have is kind of this perpetuation of minor differences. And what Weber was worried about was that in a situation where you've got minor differences, everyone will just, overplay their particular point of view. And Gouldner points out in the late 60s, he says, yeah, but what happens when you have really huge divisions? When you have really huge divisions, can you really sit with Weber's clear distinction between the fact value, right? In other words, are we just disenchanted because the fact value distinction doesn't unilaterally determine one value judgment? So as an analogy, does science tell us something about that? Most people, if for instance, you looked at the IPCC AR6 report that came out the other day, and I just wrote a paper about this that I sent off. And what I was struck by was that, this AR6 report lands, and Scott Morrison and Angus Fraser, Angus Fraser is the Minister for Forged Documents. And Scott Morrison and Angus Fraser held a press conference up there in Canberra just before you went into lockdown, Joan. And they came out and they just said, it's not really about politics, it's about technology. Nah, it's about politics. Right? It's about the choices that we make. And could you really read that IPCC AR6 report and think that your choices are completely open? No, there's no way you can read that report and think that your choices are completely open. It has closed down some choices and said that some choices are bad choices. Now notice that Weber, when people use the disenchantment thesis, seems to cut that off. That just doesn't strike you as true, does it? I don't think it strikes most people as true. I think most people kind of have a look at some facts and go, if I take that fact seriously, I probably should take that value judgment a bit more seriously than that other value judgment. It doesn't unilaterally determine one value judgment, but it tends to make you morally evaluate some value judgments differently than others because of whether you take those facts seriously. So science seems to be a model for that kind of thing because it's constantly pouring in this kind of data, and it's constantly pouring in factual judgments and saying, if you take this seriously, which maybe, Jason, in the legal context is, if you take this as a premise in your argument later on, right? Like you say to a jury, take as a premise in your argument that that person is innocent, not guilty, right? So if you take that factual judgment as a premise in a later argument, you will end up in a different place than if you didn't take the factual premise, as a premise in your argument. So I'm going to suggest the value of science might be in being models for how to deal with the disloyal opposition problem and how to deal with the disenchantment problem. That's it. That's all I got.
Thanks, Darren. And if everyone could join me in thanking, however you can, the presentations of all our panelists. And we've got almost 10 minutes for questions and comments, and a few have been dropped into the chat, so please keep them coming, and otherwise raise your hand if you want to ask a question yourself. But start off, Jason, there's been a couple of questions in chat directed to you from Joan and from Christiane about, on similar issues about the views of reliability in law, and Christiane asking, sort of if reliability is divorced from knowledge, how does it become distinguishable from opinion in the framework of the law? So if you can have a look at those questions in chat and maybe have a go at them.
Yeah, not sure I can offer much useful stuff. But I mean, yeah, there is as Joan mentioned or alluded to, Sheila Jasanoff's work's been very influential in this area. And actually, there's a long history of people from science and technology studies commenting on these things. Simon Cole, and there's someone named Gary Edmond at UNSW. So there's a long tradition of that. The definition of knowledge, if you track it down to the things they cite, comes from this case, H.G. and the Queen in like 1999, and they just call it an organized field. It comes from an organized field, which again could really, there'd be nothing stopping me from saying that I've started the field of body mapping, and I have a journal of body mapping, and I give out awards to people who give presentations in it. So it's a really insufficient definition. The definition in the U.S. courts, some of you are probably familiar with this famous U.S. Supreme Court case, Daubert, which basically adopts, I guess, falsifiability. It quotes Popper in the actual decision. And suggests really that scientific validation is the key. And that's been criticized for a lot of reasons. I think a lot of the people I work with kind of approach it from a sort of, it should be kind of based on the stakes, right? So if it's evidence that's being adduced against a criminal defendant who likely doesn't have their own expert witness, then that evidence, it should have been severely tested in the past. We should know it works under conditions like this, and have been exposed to tests that would have found errors in it. And that should probably be the level of knowledge or reliability we require. It's just that and the rules that I refer to they are unbalanced in some degrees, and they do hold the prosecution to higher standards of evidence, but for some reason not with expert evidence. So that's one thing I've been working on and thinking about a lot. Not a great answer to the questions, but.
Thanks. And then there's also been some questions and comments around that issue of an institutional watchdog that Darren mentioned. And Joan, you're saying that in your work, you've found support for this idea. I'm curious, actually, if I turn to Joan, if there's particular models of what kind of watchdog is considered here, because certainly Fiona Fiddler and myself and some of our colleagues have argued that the kind of model of watchdog proposed by George Christensen and others, which will just kind of police the facts that come out the other end of scientific process, is completely the wrong way to think about it. But there might be some role for institutions which are able to support processes of science along the way. And we've argued that might be considered. But what kind of institutions were you turning up in your consultations?
Yeah, so this was expert elicitation stuff, and the reason I was surprised was precisely because of your work and the politics of it, at that particular moment. But I think what the experts were most concerned about was integrity. Okay, because everybody thinks that they do the right thing, but other people don't. And so there needs to be an independent watchdog that would be able to kind of adjudicate disputes amongst researchers making integrity, fraud sorts of claims. That was the kind of focus that came out of the conversation. Now, we weren't kind of putting models in front of people. We were letting them talk about what the issues were that they thought, and that was what the experts came up with, which just sounded very much smack in the middle of what Darren was talking about, as a kind of a surveillance model of trust in science.
Okay, we've got a question or comment from Christian. You unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Martin. My question's to Darren. So I'm very interested in Darren's brief remarks on how we might think of, you know, the value of science for a democracy. Look, my question's probably not precisely, Darren, on your contribution, which I need a bit more time to digest, but on the three, as it were, discarded ways that you began your talk with. So not being being familiar with those arguments, but not being a sociologist, I'd want to ask, have those ways been sort of totally discarded on the basis of the alienation problem and the communication distortion problems that you mentioned, or do you think there's some room for salvaging them in this discourse? So I'll keep my question that brief. Basically, is there anything salvageable of them after the critique has been, you know, been done and dusted, as it were?
Yeah, clearly the idea of experts informing public discussion, you know, that's not going to go anywhere, right? But we all know that it ends up in this kind of excess of objectivity situation, as Dan Sarowitz called it, right? Each expert kind of just, there's partisan interpretations of what the facts are, and everyone just finds their experts, right? So it's there, but it's not really performing the same kind of cut-through function that people had thought it was going to perform, right? And the same you could say for the instrumental idea, right? Once we've decided science becomes the instrument to the means, right? You know, one of the interesting things there is that I gave a talk last week to Trinity College Dublin, this expertise conference they had, and the question was, is populism, you know, and anti-intellectualism joined? And I went back and read Hofstadter's view of anti-intellectualism. And he had these interesting remarks where he talks about unreflective instrumentalism, right? Where we just focus on the means. So if we just have, even if we say that science is still the means to bring about our ends, that's kind of an anti-intellectual way, you know, to limit the role of science, right? So the only one that does any real cut-through work is the science, you know, speaks truth to power. But then people worry, of course, that science is in the service of power, right? So it's not really doing its cut-through at that moment. Right, so I think my response is to say the classic ways that science has a value, you know, they don't have the same kind of cut through of reducing our conflicts, setting clear paths that everyone can get on board of. See, that was the idea of them. Right? So they don't have that anymore.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. We have hit 1 o'clock, so we might have to draw a discussion to a close there. I'm sure we could talk for a very long time, and I'm sure that all of our panelists would be very happy to follow up with anything that you want to discuss further. I will just remind everyone that this is being part of the 2021 University of Melbourne Science Festival, and we're only halfway through. There are plenty more events to go to, so please do check out the program. And of course, we will be back here as part of our regular HPS seminar next week with Christiane Camilleri speaking about the fluctuating fortunes of David Bohm's theory. So please do get in touch with me or visit that website if you want to come along to any future HPS seminars. But otherwise, if everyone feel free to unmute yourself at this stage and join me in once again thanking our panelists for an excellent discussion, and feel free to say thanks yourself on the way out.